Grew up in a mid-sized Ohio town where everybody's business eventually became everybody else's business. My father ran a small auto repair shop, and my mother taught third grade at the elementary school 2 blocks from our house. Nothing fancy. Nothing complicated. I spent summers helping Dad torque lug nuts and winters watching Mom grade papers at the kitchen table, her red pen moving in slow, steady circles. That was the world I came from. Reliable, unglamorous, honest. I met my wife at 23. She was working the front desk at the physical therapy clinic where I'd gone after tearing my ACL in a recreational soccer league. She had this way of making every patient feel like they were the only person in the building. Warm without being fake about it. I asked her to dinner 3 times before she said yes, and I always thought that patience was the start of something good between us. We married at 26, bought a house at 29, had our son at 31. By 42, I genuinely believed we had built something solid. Not perfect. Nobody's marriage is perfect, but solid. I worked as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm, decent salary, regular hours, no exotic travel. My best friend of 17 years worked 2 floors above me in the same building, heading up the acquisitions department. We'd met in college, stayed close through every milestone you could name. His first marriage and divorce, my wedding, the birth of my son, his second attempt at happiness, my father's passing. 17 years of friendship. The kind you stop questioning because it just feels permanent, like a wall you stop noticing is there until the day it falls on you. I don't remember the exact moment I started feeling like something was wrong. It wasn't dramatic at first. It was the way my wife started keeping her phone face down on the counter. The way she laughed a little too loudly at certain texts before flipping it over. The way she started going to the gym on Tuesday evenings, which was strange because she'd always hated evening workouts. I told myself it was stress. She'd recently taken on a bigger role at her company, and I knew that came with pressure. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself a lot of things that year. My son was 11 at the time. Smart kid, quiet, loved building things. Legos, model planes, anything with instructions in small pieces. He came to me one Saturday morning in September while I was drinking coffee on the back porch and sat down beside me in that deliberate way. Kids sit when they've been working up the courage to say something. "Dad," he said, "is everything okay with you and Mom?" I looked at him. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged, picking at the edge of the patio table. "She's been on her phone a lot, and she came home late last Tuesday and I heard her tell you she was at the gym. But I saw her car in the driveway at 5 and she didn't leave until like 7:30 and the gym is only 10 minutes away." My 11-year-old had clocked it before I did. I don't know whether to be proud of him or ashamed of myself for that. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't confront her the next night either. Instead, I did something that still makes me uncomfortable to think about. I borrowed a small wireless camera from a colleague at work, the kind contractors use to monitor job sites remotely, and I set it up in the living room, pointed at the front door. Then, I went to work and I watched. I watched for 3 weeks before I saw anything. On a Wednesday evening when I was supposed to be at a dinner meeting in Columbus that ran late, I pulled up the camera feed on my phone in my hotel room. My wife came through the front door at 7:15 p.m. Behind her, wearing a jacket I recognized immediately, was my best friend. I sat on the edge of that hotel bed for a long time. Long enough for the room to get dark around me and for the phone screen to time out twice. I don't have a clean word for what I felt in those minutes. It wasn't just betrayal. That word is too small. It was like finding out the load-bearing wall in your house was hollow the whole time. I didn't call her. I didn't call him. I closed the app, and I drove home the next morning in complete silence. And when I walked through the door, I kissed my wife on the cheek and said good morning and poured myself coffee and went to help my son with his model of the Apollo 11 capsule that he'd been assembling on the dining room table. I was functioning from a place so far behind my eyes that I barely recognized myself. I spent the next 6 weeks gathering everything I could. I saved the camera footage. 6 separate incidents over that period. All on evenings I was known to be out of town or working late. I went through our shared credit card statements and found dinners I'd never been to. A hotel stay 40 minutes from our house on a night she'd told me she was at her sister's. Small purchases at places I didn't recognize. I kept a folder on a USB drive I stored at my office. I told nobody. My brother was the first person I told, about 2 months in. He's 3 years older than me, works in insurance, and has the specific kind of calm that comes from having handled other people's crises professionally for 20 years. He listened to everything I said without interrupting. Then he sat back and said, "You need to call Ellen." Ellen was his college roommate's sister. She was a family law attorney who had handled some genuinely complicated divorces in our county, and had a reputation for being methodical and relentless, without being theatrical about it. She came recommended by 3 separate people once I started quietly asking around. I met her on a Thursday afternoon, told her everything, showed her the USB drive. She reviewed the footage on her laptop in her office with the expression of someone reading a complicated contract. No emotion, just assessment. "Do you want to protect your son's custody?" she asked when she was done. "More than anything," I said. "Then we do this right," she said. "No confrontation, no accusations, nothing that changes the dynamic in the house until I tell you we're ready." "Can you do that?" I told her I could, and somehow I did. For another 3 weeks, I came home, ate dinner with my family, helped with homework, watched television beside a woman I no longer recognized, and said nothing. The morning Ellen told me we were ready, I was at work when my best friend knocked on my office door and walked in with 2 coffees like he'd done 100 times before. He sat down across from me and asked how the Henderson project was going. I looked at him. This person I'd known since we were both 22, who had been at my wedding, who had held my son as a newborn, and I felt nothing except a cold, clarifying absence of feeling, like a room that's been aired out completely. "I'm good," I said. "Busy week." He left 20 minutes later. That evening, Ellen's team filed the divorce petition. My wife came to me that night holding the envelope with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not angry, not crying, just a kind of suspended disbelief, like she was waiting to be told it was a mistake. "I don't understand," she said. "I think you do," I said. She started to say something about how it wasn't what I thought, how things had been complicated, how she'd never meant for any of it to happen. I listened to about 45 seconds of that before I told her calmly that my attorney had filed the paperwork and that I'd already arranged for her to receive full details from Ellen's office. Then I asked her, since my son was upstairs, if we could keep the next few hours quiet and figure out the logistics separately. She looked at me like I was a stranger, which I suppose at that point I was. The weeks that followed were the hardest kind of hard. Not dramatic hard, but logistical, grinding, daily hard. My son knew something was wrong. Kids always know. I told him when I sat him down that his mother and I were going to be living separately, that it was an adult situation, and that none of it was anything he'd caused or could have prevented. He nodded slowly. Then he asked, "Is it because of your friend?" I didn't answer that directly. I said that sometimes adults make choices that change things, and that my job was to make sure his life stayed as stable as possible through the change. He went back to his model plane. Later that night, I heard him crying in his room, quietly, the way kids cry when they're trying not to be heard, and I sat outside his door for a long time before I went in, and just stayed with him until he fell asleep. My best friend texted me once during this period. The message said, "I know there's nothing I can say. I'm sorry." I didn't respond. I deleted the thread. His name came up in the divorce proceedings only in the context of documentation, which Ellen handled with the particular efficiency of someone who'd done this many times and felt no need to editorialize. The professional fallout was quieter than I expected, but not non-existent. Our company was small enough that people noticed the cooling off between us. My manager, a direct and fair woman named Beverly who'd been with the company for over 20 years, pulled me aside in the 3rd week and asked if there was something going on that was affecting the working environment. I told her, briefly and without detail, that my best friend and I had had a significant falling out of a personal nature and that I was handling it through appropriate legal channels. She looked at me for a moment and said, "Is there anything the company needs to know about?" I told her no. She nodded. She never brought it up again, but she also started routing certain joint projects through a different coordinator, which I appreciated without ever saying so. The divorce itself took about 4 months. My wife initially contested several points in the asset division and wanted a custody arrangement that I wasn't willing to accept. Ellen had told me early on that if we documented the pattern of behavior, the hotel, the timestamps, the frequency, we'd have a strong position on custody. She was right. When my wife's attorney saw the full scope of what had been collected, the contested items fell away fairly quickly. I didn't gloat about that. It wasn't satisfying the way revenge fantasies in your head are satisfying. It was just the correct outcome, and I felt the thin, tired relief of someone who has been carrying something heavy and finally sets it down. My son stayed with me during the week. He saw his mother on weekends and on alternating holidays. The adjustment was rocky for the first few months. He was quieter than usual, sometimes short with me in ways that I understood weren't really about me. I didn't push. I stayed consistent, showed up to every school event, kept the routines the same. His teacher reached out to me in the third month to say he'd been a little withdrawn, but that he seemed to be doing okay and that I was clearly a steady presence for him. That meant more to me than I expected. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, a colleague I'd worked with on a long-term infrastructure project asked if I'd be interested in joining a weekend volunteer build she was organizing, a Habitat for Humanity project 2 towns over. I almost said no. I was in that phase of recovery where everything social feels like slightly too much effort. But something made me say yes. Her name was Judith. She was a structural engineer, about 3 years younger than me, recently relocated from the Pacific Northwest for a position at a firm downtown. She had this matter-of-fact warmth that I noticed immediately. She didn't perform friendliness, she just had it. Over 2 weekends of framing walls and drinking bad coffee at the build site, we talked the way you talk when you're both focused on something else. Easily, without pressure, with the conversation going wherever it wanted to go. I didn't tell her about the divorce on the first weekend, or the second. It came up naturally on the third time we'd seen each other, at a low-key dinner organized by the same colleague who'd invited me to the build. She'd asked how long I'd been in the area. I'd mentioned that my son went to school nearby. She'd connected the dots and asked gently, and I told her the short version. She didn't offer sympathy in that performative way people sometimes do. She just nodded and said, "That sounds like a hard year." Then she asked about my son, what he was into, what he was like, and something about that shift from the hard part to the human part felt like an exhale. We took it slow, very slow. I wasn't ready to be anything except honest about that, and she respected it in a way that didn't feel like patience stretched thin. She had her own history, a long-term relationship that had ended 2 years before, amicably but still with weight. And she understood that people who've been through real loss don't snap back to their factory settings. My son met her after about 8 months of us spending time together. He shook her hand very formally, which made her laugh, and then she asked him what he was currently building. He showed her the model of the International Space Station he'd started. They spent 45 minutes on the floor of the living room examining the instruction diagrams together, and I stood in the doorway watching it and felt something shift back into place that I hadn't even realized was displaced. A year after the divorce was final, Beverly called me into her office and offered me a director-level promotion that had been in the works for several months. She mentioned, in passing, that the restructuring had involved a few departmental changes. She didn't specify. I didn't ask. I knew what had changed, and I let it stay unspoken. I ran into my ex-wife once, about 2 years after everything. She was coming out of a coffee shop near our old neighborhood as I was going in. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the time of day. We stopped and talked for a few minutes. She asked about our son, how school was going. I told her he'd just placed second in his county's academic decathlon, and that he was building increasingly complex models and talking about wanting to study aerospace engineering someday. She smiled at that, and it was the genuine kind, the one I recognized from before everything fell apart. She told me, without my asking, that things hadn't worked out with my former best friend, that it had ended badly, that she'd realized some things too late. She didn't say it looking for absolution. She said it the way someone says something they need to say out loud, regardless of the response. I told her I was sorry to hear it hadn't worked out. I meant it mostly. "You seem good," she said. "I am good," I said. She nodded. We said goodbye, and I went inside and ordered my coffee and stood at the window for a minute watching the street. Not sad exactly, not satisfied either. Just settled, like the page had turned and the new chapter was already well underway, and what was on the previous page was just part of a longer story. Judith and I got married 18 months after that coffee shop encounter, in a small outdoor ceremony at a park near the river with about 40 people, family, close friends, a handful of colleagues. My son was my best man, at 12 years old, in a blazer that was slightly too big for him, and a tie he'd knotted himself with a YouTube tutorial. He gave a toast that made half the room cry, including me. My former best friend moved out of state about a year into the divorce proceedings. I heard through occasional mutual contacts that things had been professionally complicated for him after everything became known in certain circles. Not catastrophically, but the kind of quiet cost that follows certain choices. I didn't track it closely. I didn't need to. What I learned, and I'm still learning it, honestly, is that the version of loyalty I thought I had, the kind I'd been careful to maintain in both my marriage and my friendship for over a decade, was not a transaction. I wasn't owed the same back just because I'd given it. That's a hard thing to accept, and I don't think I fully accepted it for a long time. But Judith has this way of describing trust. She calls it a decision you remake every day, not a contract you sign once. And the more I sit with that, the more it makes sense to me. My son is 15 now. He built a fully functional model of a Mars lander last spring for a school science fair and took first place in his district. He's tall, quiet in the way thoughtful people are quiet, and he has this wry sense of humor that comes out sideways when you're not expecting it. He's close with Judith, not in a way that replaces anything. He knows the shape of his family, knows where everything fits, but in a real way, a chosen way. The kind that holds weight. There are nights I sit on the back porch with a coffee, same as always, and I think about what the last few years actually cost and what they gave back. The cost was real. The years of thinking I knew the people closest to me, the disorientation of having to rebuild your understanding of your own history. The look on my son's face the night I told him things were changing. But I'm sitting here. The house is quiet in that good way. My son is upstairs, probably pulling instructions out of a model kit he just ordered. My wife is on the couch reading, one lamp on, the dog asleep at her feet. The wall came down. I built something better where it stood. That's enough. I've thought a lot about what I could have done differently. Not in the marriage. I've made peace with the fact that I can't own what someone else chose to do. But in how I handled the aftermath, whether I stayed calm because I was genuinely strong or because I was numb, whether the 6 weeks I spent gathering evidence was discipline or just delay, I don't have a clean answer to any of that, and I've stopped needing one. What I do know is this. The way things played out had very little to do with luck. Every consequence in that story, every single one, traced back to a choice someone made. My wife chose to bring someone into our home who had been at our wedding. My best friend chose to walk through that door. And I chose, when I found out, not to blow everything apart in one night of shouting and accusation. I chose to be methodical. I chose Ellen. I chose to protect my son first, and my pride not at all. That's not wisdom I was born with. That's something you arrive at when you realize that reacting fast mostly just makes you feel better for about 10 minutes and then makes everything worse for a long time after. I was angry. I want to be clear about that. I was angrier than I've ever been in my life, but anger that you let run the show tends to hand the other person a way out. It makes you the problem. I didn't want to be the problem. I wanted to be the person still standing when it was over, with my son, with my integrity, with a life I could actually live in. My son figured it out before I did. An 11-year-old watched the timestamps and the driveway and did the math. I think about that a lot. Not because it embarrasses me, though honestly, it should a little. I think about it because it tells me something about who he is. Careful, observant, someone who trusts what he sees over what he's told. I hope I've given him more of that, not less. I hope watching me handle this the way I did showed him that being steady is not the same as being weak, that patience is not the same as not caring, that you can be absolutely devastated and still function, still show up, still get it right. What happened to the people who made different choices is not something I tracked closely or celebrated. It happened the way these things tend to happen when you make decisions that have real costs attached to them, and you either don't see those costs coming or you decide not to care. That's not karma in any mystical sense. It's just the ordinary arithmetic of cause and effect playing out on its own timeline. Judith once said something to me, early on, that I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count. She said the people who recover well from betrayal aren't the ones who get over it fastest. They're the ones who decide at some point to invest their energy forward instead of backward. She wasn't telling me to forget anything. She was telling me where to aim. I aimed at my son. I aimed at my work. I aimed at my work. I aimed at building something honest. And here I am on the other side of it, and the only thing I know for certain is that none of it, not the quiet patience, not the recovery, not any of it, came from anywhere except the daily decision to keep choosing the harder, slower, more deliberate path. That's the only thing I pass on if someone asks me what I learned.